Most neighborhood disputes don't start with something big. They don't begin with lawsuits, shouting matches, or public meltdowns in front yards. They usually start small. A petty rule. A little jab. A ridiculous power play. And in my case, it all started with a trash can. Every Tuesday morning, I did what any decent homeowner would do. I rolled my bin out to the curb before heading to work. Simple. Routine. Normal. But unlike every other house on the street, my bin never seemed to stay put. By the time I came back in the evening, it was tipped over, its lid wide open like a gaping mouth, and half my trash strewn across the sidewalk. At first, I thought it was just the wind. After all, we'd had a few blustery days. But then I noticed something odd. None of my neighbors' cans had been touched. Their lids stayed closed, their trash stayed neatly bagged, and their driveways stayed spotless. Mine, on the other hand, looked like a raccoon had hosted a midnight buffet. The second week it happened, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I just got unlucky, I muttered to myself as I stuffed stray coffee cups and pizza boxes back into the bin. I even checked for paw prints, thinking maybe it really was an animal problem. But then came the third week. And this time, the lid hadn't just been blown open. No, my can had been shoved hard enough to land halfway in the street, forcing my neighbor across the road to drag it back before a car hit it. That's when I realized something wasn't right. Trash cans don't just roll themselves across the asphalt. Something, or someone, was pushing it over. The confirmation came the following Tuesday morning. Normally, I left for work around 8 o'clock, but that day I was running late. As I walked out the front door with my briefcase, I saw her. Karen. Our self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. She wasn't just another neighbor, she was the HOA president, a title she wore like a crown. Every time you saw her, she had that same uniform. Pastel sweater tied neatly around her shoulders, oversized sunglasses, tennis visor, and of course, the ever-present clipboard tucked under her arm. I watched her march down the sidewalk like she was conducting an inspection of the Queen's Guards. Then she stopped in front of my trash can. She glanced left, then right, making sure no one was watching, except she didn't realize I was standing on my porch. And then, with a sharp little kick, she sent my bin toppling over. Bags burst. Coffee grounds spilled. And there she was, grinning to herself as if she'd just saved the neighborhood from imminent ruin. I froze. For a split second, I almost shouted, almost marched right down the driveway to confront her. But then I remembered who I was dealing with. Karen wasn't the type you argued with. She was the type who twisted stories, turned neighbors against each other, and cited obscure HOA bylaws like scripture. If I charged at her in anger, she'd spin it into a tale of aggressive harassment. No, I had to be smarter than that. She wanted me to explode. She wanted me to give her ammunition. So instead, I just raised my coffee cup in a polite little salute and called out, "Morning, Karen." The look on her face was priceless, like a deer caught in headlights, but she quickly masked it with that fake smile and waved before scurrying off. That's when I knew. She thought she was untouchable. Inside, though, my blood was boiling. Who goes around knocking over trash cans like a middle school bully? Who wakes up in the morning and decides, you know what, I'm going to scatter someone's garbage today? The answer was simple. Karen. She lived for control. For petty little power plays. For reminding everyone that she was the head of the HOA and we were all her subjects. But she had underestimated me. I wasn't just going to sit back and clean up her messes week after week. If she wanted to play games, fine. I could play too. Except I wouldn't just fight back. I'd make sure the entire neighborhood saw her for who she really was. So I cleaned up the trash one more time, calmly and quietly, without giving her the satisfaction of a fight. But in my mind, the wheels were already turning. If Karen wanted to keep knocking over my trash can, then it was time to give her a trash can she definitely didn't see coming. I couldn't let myself be the guy who simply complained about a problem and did nothing. That's not my style. I'm the sort of neighbor who reads the manual, watches a few how-to videos, and then builds whatever gadget will solve the problem while also delivering a little poetic justice. So that night I went into full research mode. I devoured forums where people argued about raccoons and drone-mounted bird feeders. I skimmed product reviews for motion sensor deterrents and read one too many, how I got my HOA to back down posts. The more I read, the clearer it became. There were clever, low-cost contraptions out there designed to keep critters away, and a lot of them would work brilliantly on an entitled HOA bully. I wanted something that would be obvious, embarrassing, and, crucially, impossible for Karen to plausibly deny or spin into victimhood. I decided on two elements. First, a can that would make tampering impossible without an obvious reaction. Second, a little extra theatrics. Cameras were tempting, a direct video would nail her, but I knew how the HOA game was played. Karen loved to claim privacy violations or imply that recording in public was invasive. I needed something that would reveal itself in plain sight and be undeniable to anyone who witnessed it. After some scheming and a trip to a hardware store, I came home with a heavy-duty trash can, a spring-loaded base that resisted tipping, and a compact, battery-powered air horn with a motion trigger. The spring base would keep the can upright under normal conditions. The horn would give a loud, startling blast if the can was forced past a set threshold. I also bought a simple doorbell-style camera, not to be sneaky, but to have a backup. If things escalated into HOA paperwork, a short clip would help prove intent. But for now, the horn was the main event. Installation felt like prepping for a small theatrical performance. I anchored the spring base into the concrete of my driveway with tamper-proof bolts so it wouldn't simply be pried up and tossed. Then I modified the can a little. I mounted the air horn inside a discreet compartment near the rim and wired it to a motion switch position so that a hard shove would trip it. A gentle nudge from the wind or a trash-collecting arm wouldn't set it off. This was calibrated to respond only to a purposeful push. I ran through a dozen tests that night, polite little taps that produced nothing, followed by a hard shove that made me jump and laugh at my own work when the horn let out a roar. It was loud enough to make you drop whatever you were holding. Exactly the kind of startle that would make a bully pause and, if done right, make the whole neighborhood look up for morning coffee. I also set the camera on a nearby lamppost, angled to capture the sidewalk and the porch. It was visible enough that anyone walking by would see it and assume they were being watched, which in itself might act as a deterrent. Over the next few days, I played it cool. I never mentioned the new rig to anyone. I watched the can from inside the house sometimes, pretending to water the plants while checking through the blinds. When neighbors stopped by to chat, I kept things small-talk-y and friendly. I wanted the setup to look like just another homeowner doing a bit of maintenance, not a vindictive trap. Part of the plan was optics. If Karen were to be startled publicly, the whole neighborhood had to see it as a justified response to her repeated harassment, not a mean-spirited ambush. So I kept my interactions with the HOA subtly right. I smiled at Mrs. Henderson when she walked her poodle, deliberately mowed my lawn the weekend before trash day, and didn't give Karen so much as a scowl when she waved her clipboard at my lawn care. I wanted the stage set, an ordinary, amicable homeowner who had finally had enough of petty bullying. The night before trash pickup, I slept poorly, going over contingencies. What if the horn failed? What if Karen claimed the can fell on its own? What if she tried to drag the narrative into the HOA's tiny rulebook and get me fined for tampering with community property? I rehearsed a calm response for each scenario. If the horn failed but the camera captured her, I'd go through HOA channels with evidence. If she tried to make me the aggressor, I'd present myself as composed and reasonable, demonstrate the repeated nature of the harassment, and let the community's common sense do the rest. I also thought about consequences. This wasn't about humiliating someone to the point of harm. The horn was startling but harmless, the spring base prevented physical harm, and the visible camera was there to keep things honest. My plan was firmly in the realm of social accountability, exposing behavior that had been normalized and tolerated for too long. Trash day arrived like any other Tuesday, except that I felt like a kid on Christmas morning. I took a final look at the can before putting the lid on, the horn tucked inside, the spring base locked, the camera blinking quietly. I placed a single, conspicuous bag of trash on top, nothing gross, just a box from the new coffee maker I'd been meaning to assemble, and rolled the can to the curb with casual, deliberate hands. Then I retreated to the porch with a steaming mug and a face that betrayed nothing. As neighbors began their own weekly routines, I watched for Karen. Her presence had become predictable. She did her rounds mid-morning, clipboard in a rigid grip, eyes scanning for violations. I tried to read her like an open book, and sure enough, around 10:05 she appeared at the far end of the block, visor perfectly straight, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. She didn't hurry, she sauntered like someone on a mission that, I suspected, involved my trash can. When she approached, my heartbeat kicked up, but my face stayed neutral. She paused at Mrs. Lyle's immaculate hydrangea, nodded as if approvingly, and then turned toward my house. For a moment she looked straight at me and I gave her a measured, neighborly smile. She returned it with a tilt of her mouth, then stopped, shifting her gaze to the can. She lifted her clipboard, checked something, and then, with a precision I'd come to hate, she stomped the side of the bin. The world seemed to slow for a second, the way you watch a match flicker right before it snuffs, and then the horn erupted. It was loud, abrupt, and perfect. The shock froze her mid-step, her clipboard clattered to the sidewalk. Neighbors on porches looked up. Someone in the house across the street opened a window. Karen staggered from the sound, her sunglasses askew, hair falling out from under the visor, and in that one split second she went from confident tyrant to startled human being. I held my breath, because in that brief space everything could still revert. She could turn on me and claim humiliation, or she could make a scene that turned neighbors away. But she didn't. The horn's howl had drawn attention, and for the first time I saw doubt flicker across her face like a weak commercial. She wasn't sure what had happened, only that she had been loudly called out. That hesitation, the moment she wasn't sure how to perform her role, was the crack I'd been waiting for. The camera had the shot, the neighbors had seen it, and I had a plan to make sure the truth wouldn't stay buried under Karen's usual story. The trap had been set. Now all that was left was to watch what she would do next. The sound echoed across the street like a siren blast. It wasn't just a little squeak or a modest honk. It was the kind of earth-shaking, eardrum-rattling roar that made everyone freeze in place for a heartbeat. Karen herself leapt back as if the trash can had grown fangs and lunged at her. Her clipboard clattered onto the pavement, papers scattering across the curb in a disorganized flutter that seemed to mock her carefully cultivated image of control. She let out a strangled gasp, half yelp and half scream, and immediately whipped around to see who was watching. Of course, half the neighborhood was watching. Mr. Lyle, who had been trimming his hedges, leaned on his clippers with a grin. Mrs. Henderson's little poodle started barking, and kids on bikes stopped mid-pedal, wide-eyed and laughing. Karen's cheeks flushed a shade of crimson I didn't think human skin could achieve. I stayed perfectly still on my porch, mug in hand, pretending to be just another surprised observer. Inside, I was buzzing with triumph, but outside, I wore my most polite expression. "Everything all right, Karen?" I called out, my tone syrupy with faux concern. She fumbled with her sunglasses, pushing them back up her nose, and stammered something unintelligible. For a moment, she bent down to pick up her scattered paperwork, but the second her hand reached for the clipboard, the horn gave a second shorter blast, just a programmed double-trigger I'd set to ensure the gag worked even if she made a follow-up shove. That second honk sent her practically hopping backward, clutching her chest like the trash can had personally declared war. Laughter rippled from across the street, not cruel but uncontrollable, the kind of laughter that spreads when something ridiculous happens in public. Karen tried to recover. She straightened her sweater, pulled her visor lower, and gave the crowd her best, nothing to see here wave. But the damage was done. Her reputation as the all-powerful HOA queen had taken a hit, and she knew it. You could see it in the way her jaw tightened and her steps quickened as she gathered her things. She didn't even attempt to touch the trash can again. Instead, she scribbled something furiously on her clipboard, probably a note for later vengeance, and stomped off down the sidewalk without so much as a glance in my direction. The air horn, now silent, stood guard like a smug sentinel. My trap had sprung, and it had worked better than I dared hope. The neighborhood didn't let it go quietly. By noon, 3 different neighbors had stopped by my porch, each trying to suppress their chuckles as they, casually, brought up the morning's entertainment. Mr. Lyle asked if I'd gotten a new brand of garbage can. Mrs. Henderson confided that she'd always suspected Karen of snooping where she shouldn't. Even the kids on their bikes buzzed by with a chorus of mock air horn sounds. For once, the conversation wasn't about me, it was about Karen. And the more people laughed, the more her aura of control began to crumble. This wasn't just about a trash can anymore. This was about exposing the pettiness she'd hidden behind HOA bylaws and fake smiles. That night, I sat on my porch again, looking at the trash can standing proudly upright where it belonged. The plan had worked, but something told me Karen wouldn't take this humiliation lying down. She was already scheming, already scribbling on her clipboard, already plotting a way to spin this in her favor. I could almost hear her voice rehearsing lines like, "It was a safety hazard," or "that homeowner is disrupting community peace." I knew her too well to believe this was the end. The horn may have been heard around the block, but in Karen's world, this was just the opening volley of a war she wasn't ready to lose. And if she thought she could intimidate me into retreating, she was about to find out I had more than one trick up my sleeve. For the next 2 days, the neighborhood was abuzz with whispers and chuckles about Karen's run-in with my trash can. Every time someone mentioned the horn incident, I could practically feel her seething from across the cul-de-sac. Karen wasn't used to being the butt of a joke. She was used to controlling the narrative, dictating the tone, making sure every neighbor remembered she was the HOA president, the enforcer of community standards. Having her moment of humiliation broadcast for the whole block to see, that was a wound she couldn't let heal. I knew she'd come after me, I just didn't know how fast. Turns out, I didn't have to wait long. On Thursday evening, just as the sun dipped behind the pines, I heard the sharp clack-clack of heels on the driveway. Karen was marching toward my porch, clipboard tucked under one arm, the other hand clutching a manila envelope. Her posture was stiffer than usual, chin lifted so high she could have looked down on a giraffe. She didn't knock. She didn't greet me. She simply stood at the foot of the steps and announced, "We need to talk about your contraption." The way she spat the word made it sound like I'd installed a medieval catapult instead of a tricked-out trash can. I set down my coffee mug slowly, as if I'd been expecting her, and gave her my calmest smile. "Evening, Karen. Lovely weather, isn't it?" That fake smile of hers faltered for a split second before she tightened it back into place. She launched into her speech without pause. According to her, my trash can posed a safety hazard to the community. It was a violation of HOA noise ordinances. It could cause injury or emotional distress. She even waved the envelope like it was some kind of legal decree, though I suspected it was nothing more than a stack of hastily typed HOA complaint forms. She tried to pepper her accusations with big words and legal-sounding phrases, but the more she talked, the more it sounded like desperation. The neighbors knew the truth. They had seen what happened. And she hadn't been injured by my can, she had been caught bullying. Still, Karen's power didn't lie in facts, it lay in paperwork, meetings, and relentless pressure. And she made it very clear, if I didn't immediately remove the modifications, she'd fine me for every day the hazardous device remained on my property. I listened patiently, nodding in all the right places, and when she finally stopped to catch her breath, I asked a single question, "Karen, why were you touching my trash can in the first place?" The silence that followed was golden. She blinked, opened her mouth, then closed it again. For once, she didn't have a ready-made answer. I let the question hang in the air, heavy and sharp, until she cleared her throat and mumbled something about routine inspections. I almost laughed out loud, as if kicking over my bin was part of her HOA job description. But I didn't. Instead, I just leaned back in my chair and said, "Well, Karen, if you leave my property alone, my contraption won't bother you, will it?" The look she gave me could have curdled milk. She spun on her heel, muttering about escalating this matter to the board, and stormed back down the driveway. The next morning, I found out what she meant by escalation. Taped to my front door was a bright yellow slip, an official notice of violation. According to the paper, I had 3 days to remove unauthorized equipment, or face a fine of $200 per day. I knew Karen had written it herself. The language was as petty as her attitude. But it was also official HOA stationery, which meant the battle was moving from driveways and sidewalks into the bureaucratic arena she thrived in. If the horn was round 1, this was round 2. And I had a decision to make, comply and lose, or fight back on her turf and risk the full weight of the HOA. I stood there on my porch, notice in hand, and I couldn't help but smile. Because if Karen wanted a war, I was more than ready to fight. When Karen slid that yellow notice under my door, she thought she'd forced me into compliance. What she didn't account for was that the same neighbors who'd snickered over coffee weren't exactly thrilled with her brand of community leadership. Word spread fast. Mrs. Henderson organized a group text that read like a running commentary on petty tyrants. Mr. Lyle offered to bring his tablet to the meeting and show a slideshow of before and after photos. He had a flair for dramatics. Even the teens who'd been mocking air horn impressions volunteered that they'd seen the whole thing from their driveway and would testify. When the HOA scheduled a special meeting for the following Tuesday evening, 7 p.m., Community Center, bring your water bottles, I knew the stage had shifted from curbside theatrics to a spotlighted, quasi-legal performance. I couldn't help but grin. This was Karen's element, but now the audience was siding with me. I walked into that fluorescent-lit community room like a man who'd rehearsed this act in his sleep. The folding chairs smelled faintly of gym socks and institutional cleaning spray. The HOA president's podium gleamed with the official seal. Karen sat at the front, flanked by two stoic board members, their faces carved in seriousness. She looked determined, as if she'd rehearsed the exact cadence of outrage she planned to deliver. Behind me, neighbors filled the chairs, some curious, some amused, some plainly fed up. When it was my turn, I approached calmly, carrying a small binder, the camera footage time-stamped, printouts of the weeks of tipped bins, a copy of the yellow notice, and a polite one-page statement explaining the safety measures I'd installed. My plan wasn't to inflame, it was to present facts clearly and let the room decide who sounded reasonable. Karen began, predictably, with volume. She described dangerous contraptions, community standards, and a homeowner acting unilaterally. She painted a picture of civic disorder and waved the HOA bylaws as if they were a gospel. Then she leaned into theatrics, of course she did, recounting, in dramatic fashion, how she had simply been checking the alignment of trash cans before being assaulted by an explosive noise. A few titters escaped the crowd. When my turn came, I clicked play on the tablet. There was the clip, Karen marching down the sidewalk, the precise kick, the horn, the stunned pause, and the faces of neighbors peering from porches. I didn't embellish. I pointed out that the device was non-harmful, calibrated to avoid false triggers, and visible enough to act as both deterrent and proof. I explained, calmly and plainly, that after weeks of harassment, trash knocked over, property disrespected, I'd installed a measure that was defensive, proportional, and documented. I watched faces shift from polite curiosity to something that looked suspiciously like solidarity. The board convened into a hushed, procedural whisper, the kind that comes with signatures, rules, and the possibility of fines. Karen argued for enforcement. Her allies wanted the notice enforced immediately. But then something happened that Karen hadn't counted on. 3 neighbors stood up one after another. Mrs. Henderson described how she'd woken to find trash strewn in her driveway years ago until she learned to lock her bin lid. Mr. Lyle produced photos of Karen with a clipboard near another neighbor's property last month. Even a gruff-looking man who rarely spoke cleared his throat and said, "We've had enough." The room's tone shifted. The board members, who'd been leaning into the formality of bylaws, now had to contend with a chorus of residents recounting repeated petty intrusions and long-standing grievances. They looked at the camera footage, reviewed the timeline, and had to reconcile the difference between technical violation language and the social reality. Someone had been harassing a neighbor, and the neighbor had responded with a visible, non-dangerous deterrent. After what felt like an eternity, the board chair adjusted his glasses and announced a compromise. The device itself did raise a procedural question, so rather than fine me immediately, the board would request written specifications for the modification and an agreement to register the device as a property security measure, essentially legalizing it under controlled conditions. Karen, furious but publicly muted, sputtered that this was an affront to community standards. The room, however, had already made up its mind in small, decisive ways. Laughter at her abrupt humiliation had turned into a recognition that petty power abuses deserved public accountability. The motion passed with a majority, and the board asked that both sides, Karen and myself, attend a mediation session to clear the air and establish boundaries. As people filed out, several neighbors patted my back, a few gave me winks, and Mr. Lyle offered a triumphant, "Told you so." I left the community center that night with a folder of paper, a small official nod of approval, and the unmistakable sense that the dynamic in our little neighborhood had shifted. Karen hadn't lost her title, but she'd lost an easy, unquestioned authority, at least for now. The HOA board scheduled the mediation for Saturday morning in the clubhouse, a place usually reserved for birthday parties and book clubs. That morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, bouncing off the polished wooden floor. Folding chairs had been arranged in a small circle, intimate, deliberately so, as if forced proximity would breed civility. The board chair, Mr. Patel, sat at the head of the circle with a stack of papers and an air of exhaustion that suggested he'd rather be mowing his lawn than refereeing another Karen conflict. I walked in with a calm nod, carrying the same folder I'd brought to the meeting, plus a thermos of coffee. A few seconds later, Karen arrived in full battle regalia. Visor, sunglasses, pastel sweater knotted with surgical precision, and a stack of binders thick enough to topple a bookshelf. She sat down across from me without so much as a hello, jaw clenched, papers clutched like weapons. The session began with polite formality. Mr. Patel reminded us that the purpose was resolution and understanding. He invited Karen to speak first, and she launched into a familiar tirade. She claimed my trash can device was aggressive and dangerous, that it violated noise ordinances, and that it had left her shaken and distressed for days. She even slipped in a line about her blood pressure, as though the air horn had nearly sent her to the ER. Theatrics, all of it. I waited for her to finish, hands folded, expression neutral. When my turn came, I spoke evenly. I described weeks of harassment, my can repeatedly knocked over, and the clear evidence of her behavior captured on camera. I explained how the device had been carefully calibrated not to injure but to deter. If left alone, I concluded, the can makes no sound at all. The only way it activates is if someone intentionally tips it. And the only person who has done that is sitting right here. The room went quiet. Karen's nostrils flared behind her oversized shades. Mr. Patel, trying to mediate, suggested a compromise. Perhaps I could keep the modified can but agree to disable the horn, using only the spring base. Perhaps Karen could agree not to approach my property or bins without permission. It was a fair, sensible solution. But Karen couldn't accept it. She leaned forward, practically vibrating with indignation, and snapped, "I don't need to agree to anything. I'm the HOA president. I oversee compliance. If I see a violation, I'm going to act on it. That's my right." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, the veneer of control slipping. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Karen had just admitted, in a formal mediation, that she felt entitled to tamper with private property under the guise of oversight. She realized too late what she'd said. Her lips pressed together, but the damage was already done. The session unraveled from there. Karen refused to sign any agreement, instead demanding that I dismantle the device entirely. I refused, reminding everyone that the board had already ruled I could keep it with documentation. The board chair sighed, rubbed his temples, and finally declared the mediation a failure. He would submit a formal report to the board, but as it stood, I was within my rights to keep the modified can, provided I didn't expand the setup. Karen's binder of accusations had collapsed into a messy heap, her indignation boiling over into muttered insults about troublemakers and people who don't belong. She stormed out of the clubhouse, heels clacking like gunfire, leaving behind a trail of paperwork and the distinct smell of frustration. I sat there for a moment after she left, sipping from my thermos while the board members gathered their notes. One of them, a quiet woman named Angela, leaned over and whispered, "Don't let her get to you. Half this neighborhood's tired of her nonsense." Mr. Patel gave me a weary smile. "Just keep it civil. She's not done." His words stuck with me as I walked home. The battle over the trash can wasn't just about garbage anymore. It was about power, reputation, and the unraveling authority of a woman who'd ruled unchecked for too long. Karen had lost ground in that room, but the way she stormed out told me one thing with certainty. She was about to escalate in a way none of us expected. The week after mediation was eerily quiet. No yellow notices taped to my door. No passive-aggressive emails about community decorum. Not even Karen's familiar clip-clop footsteps echoing down the sidewalk in the morning. It was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I knew her too well to think she'd simply accept defeat. Karen didn't surrender, she regrouped. And sure enough, on Friday afternoon, the storm arrived. I was sipping coffee on the porch when I heard a commotion down the street. Raised voices, the unmistakable snap of Karen's commanding tone, and then the shuffle of a small crowd moving toward my house. I set the mug down slowly. Showtime. Karen appeared at the head of the group like a general marching her troops into battle. Behind her were 3 HOA board members, 2 of whom looked like they'd been dragged along against their will, and a handful of curious neighbors trailing behind as though attending a parade. She carried a stack of printed notices, bright orange this time, not yellow, flashing them around like warrants. Her voice rang out across the cul-de-sac, "This property is in serious violation of community safety standards. The board has the right to demand immediate compliance." She was putting on a performance, staging her last stand in front of as many witnesses as possible. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about reclaiming power, making a spectacle, rewriting the story with herself as the fearless leader saving the neighborhood. I stepped off the porch, hands in my pockets, expression calm. "Karen," I said evenly, "you're trespassing." That single word made the onlookers murmur. She froze, just long enough for doubt to flicker, before rallying with a louder declaration, "The HOA has the authority to enter and inspect any property that violates bylaws." Her words dripped with confidence, but the neighbors weren't buying it. Mr. Lyle muttered, "Pretty sure trash cans don't count." Mrs. Henderson crossed her arms and added, "And pretty sure knocking one over isn't in the bylaws either." The tide was turning, right there on the sidewalk. Karen sensed it too, which only made her double down. She strutted toward my driveway, orange notice in hand, ready to slap it onto my bin like some final act of conquest. But she didn't count on the air horn still being active. The moment she grabbed the lid to make her point, the horn blasted again, louder than ever, echoing off garages and rattling the air. Karen shrieked, dropping the notice, and stumbled backward onto the grass. The crowd erupted, not just in laughter this time, but applause. Someone actually clapped. Kids on bikes mimicked the horn in chorus. The board members looked horrified, not at me, but at Karen, who was now scrambling to her feet, her pastel sweater stained with grass, visor askew. She shouted something about malicious entrapment, but her voice was drowned out by the spontaneous chorus of laughter and horns. The neighborhood had made its judgment, and Karen had lost her authority not through rules or fines, but through sheer public spectacle. Red-faced and trembling, Karen shoved her papers back into her bag and stormed down the street, the crowd parting like water. Nobody followed her. Nobody defended her. They stayed clustered near my driveway, buzzing with the shared energy of a moment that felt bigger than just a trash can. It was the breaking of a spell. 4 years, Karen had ruled with intimidation and paperwork, but one ridiculous air horn had cracked that facade wide open. As the neighbors dispersed, I stood by the can, watching it sit proudly upright in the afternoon sun, and realized something profound. The trash can had become a symbol. It wasn't about garbage anymore. It was about standing up to petty tyranny with creativity, patience, and a little well-timed noise. And though Karen wasn't finished entirely, her last stand had ended not in victory, but in humiliation. The neighborhood felt different in the days that followed Karen's dramatic defeat. The air seemed lighter, freer, as though everyone had exhaled a long-held breath. 4 years, Karen's presence had been like a shadow cast over every backyard barbecue, every mailbox conversation, every lawn ornament that strayed an inch from regulation. But now, people spoke with a new energy. When I walked to get the mail, neighbors I'd barely exchanged nods with before now stopped to chat. Some offered firm handshakes, others grinned and muttered things like, "About time someone stood up to her." Even the kids, who had witnessed the horn blast firsthand, now zoomed past my house on their bikes, mimicking the sound of the air horn with gleeful shrieks. What had once been a point of tension had become a story the whole neighborhood shared, retold with chuckles and exaggerated gestures. Karen had wanted a spectacle, and she got one, but not the kind she'd hoped for. Karen herself, on the other hand, was noticeably absent. For days, no one saw her patrolling the sidewalks with her clipboard. The visor was nowhere to be found. Rumor spread quickly. She had been asked to take a step back from HOA leadership while the board reviewed her conduct. Some whispered that she'd been pressured into resignation, others claimed she was simply on vacation. Either way, the empire she'd built on fear and fines had cracked. Without her constant surveillance, the board seemed more approachable, even human. Mr. Patel stopped by one afternoon with a smile and said, "We'll be implementing some new community guidelines, less about punishment, more about cooperation." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. All it had taken was a stubborn man, a reinforced trash can, and an air horn to shift the entire culture of the neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, small but significant changes took root. The HOA meetings transformed from tense interrogations into actual discussions, where people voiced concerns without fear of being ridiculed. Neighbors who once avoided one another began to organize small gatherings, cookouts, yard sales, even a movie night projected against a garage door. It was as if Karen's fall had given everyone permission to reclaim their community from the stranglehold of rules and pettiness. My trash can, once the centerpiece of conflict, now stood as a quirky landmark. People joked about it, but with respect. "That's the can that broke Karen," someone said at the cookout, raising a drink in mock salute. We all laughed, but beneath the laughter was something more: solidarity. Karen's legacy, however, lingered. She hadn't vanished completely. Every now and then, I'd spot her car parked outside her house, curtains drawn tight. She no longer commanded the sidewalks, but her presence was felt, like the faint outline of a stain that never quite washes out. Still, her power was broken. She had tried to use the HOA as her weapon, but in the end, her obsession with control had undone her. And though I knew she might try to claw her way back in some form, the neighborhood had seen behind the curtain. They had laughed at her most dramatic moment. Authority built on intimidation doesn't survive laughter, it crumbles under it. On a quiet Sunday morning, I stood once again on my porch with a cup of coffee, gazing at the now peaceful street. The trash can sat upright at the curb, sturdy, unbothered, and silent. No one dared knock it over anymore, not because of the horn, but because of what it had come to represent. It was more than a receptacle for garbage. It was a reminder that even the pettiest battles can spark change when you refuse to back down. For me, the lesson was clear. Sometimes the best way to stand up to tyranny, no matter how small, isn't through anger or aggression. It's through creativity, patience, and a little humor. The HOA still existed, rules still applied, but the balance of power had shifted. And as the neighborhood slowly transformed into a place where people actually wanted to live, I realized something with a satisfied smile. The war had started with trash, but it ended with community.